Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. I'm happy to welcome you to our AuthLIB panel titled Illiberal Challengers of Liberal Democracy in Europe. What we will talk about today under this fairly broad title is going to be much more focused. We will zoom in on those political actors which we have seen rising, gaining ground, or just simply solidifying their hold on power in the recent European parliamentary elections, and those which may be lesser talked about in the broader European discussions, but are equally important and might actually gain ground in upcoming elections in Austria and the Czech Republic. In that regard, we will zoom in on the appeal and potential impact of the Austrian Freedom Party, as the Austrian elections are coming up just next weekend. And we will also take a close look at the Czech ANO party, led by former Prime Minister Andrej Babiš. This is to also show that illiberal challengers come in a variety of colors, with a variety of ideologies. And this is something that we in the AuthLIB project are trying to explore. AuthLIB, or in its longer form, Neo-authoritarianisms in Europe and the Liberal Democratic Response, is a 3-year Horizon project funded by the European Union and UK Research and Innovation. It is led by the CEU Democracy Institute by Professor Zsolt Enyedi. In this project, we have the motto: to protect the future of liberal democracy in Europe, one must first understand its challengers. And this is precisely what we are trying to do here, taking at closer looks on national level developments as well as on the European level. To do so, we have 3 excellent speakers joining us today who will help us make sense of this variety and its potential impact. We have with us here in person at the CEU campus in Budapest, Marlene Vind, who is a Danish political scientist specializing on the interlinkages of law and politics in Europe. She's a professor of political science at the University of Copenhagen and the director of the Center for European Policy. Online, we have with us Laurenz Ennser-Jedenastik, professor of Austrian politics at the University of Vienna, who has been specializing on parties, elites, and welfare state and social policy in the Austrian context. And we also have with us Petra Guasti, who is an associate professor at Charles University, focusing mainly on democracy and participation and inclusiveness in representative democracies. I also have to say that today's discussion is recorded and is going to be shared online after the Budapest Forum, which is hosting our panel discussion today. So without further ado, I would pose my first question to Marlene to give us a little bit of a context about the European scene. In the recent European parliamentary elections, we have seen a variety of populist Eurosceptic political forces gaining ground, and although they have not really managed a breakthrough in the European Parliament, but we do see at least the stabilization of a strong far right in the EP. In many cases, actually, these parties are in government by now, so they are becoming increasingly normalized. Yet we also see radical left forces rising in Europe. The recent elections, state elections in Germany, in Saxony and Thuringia are also a case in point. So my question to you would be, is it just the same old? Do we see the same old actors now rising for some reason? And if so, what is their appeal? Or is there something qualitatively different about the illiberals of today? in the European context.
Thank you very much, Zsuzsanna. Thanks for everyone to be here and for inviting me to Budapest again. It's such a pleasure to be here. I think you are right in saying that that's the narrative in Europe right now, that the center held at the European elections. But unfortunately, as I see it, at least, this is not enough. This is not enough to give us any kind of comfort, because as we have seen recently in Germany, the extreme right, but also the extreme left in Saxony and Thüringen have shocked the entire establishment of politics in Germany to such a degree that my prediction will be that due to this internal rise of the extreme right and the extreme populist left, we will for the next year in Europe see a complete paralyzed European Union. Not only because of what's going on in Germany, but you can clearly see that the German Chancellor always got a nervous breakdown from seeing his own party go down, and also see the coalition that he is heading being discredited in these elections. So even though we are talking about some eastern states that have always alluded to the extremes, this is a very, very dangerous moment right now in German politics. So going far beyond the European elections, what happens in the member states, and Germany is not the only one, is something that tells us that a bigger transformation is actually going on. We normally teach our students that the German-French alliance is important for any progress in the European Union, and they are certainly important for the support for Ukraine. And I really fear that after this election in Germany, but also the paralysis of French politics that we have equally seen since the European elections, where Marine Le Pen won a landslide victory, and you know, two months of no government in France, is an indication that we are in a place right now in Europe that is actually more dangerous than it has been for many years, despite the fact that if you, of course, count the numbers, you still have a center that is in power in Brussels and in Strasbourg. But what is going on underneath is much more dangerous, I would say, than what we have seen. You also talked earlier, Zsuzsanna, about, and we'll hear more about that later, Austria. We have seen Meloni in Italy. We have the Netherlands with some big problems in terms of also an extreme right government that is challenging and questioning the whole kind of philosophy of the European Union. So I'm very fearful for what's happening and will be happening in the EU, and in particular, of course, when it comes to Ukraine and how we are going to give full support to Ukraine in the coming years. I'm quite sure Putin is very happy about what's happening. I think he is clapping in his small hands for every single vote that goes to an extreme right or an extreme left party, because that is exactly what he wanted to achieve: disruption and questioning of the values we stand for in Europe and have been standing for. So I think that this is I wouldn't say, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, so I'm not going to sit here and claim that he has orchestrated everything, but there are certainly evidence that he has both been trying to influence these results and also been successful to do it. So the only thing, and it's not very comforting what I'm saying, I know that, but the only thing that could make things even worse is, of course, if Trump wins the election. So I don't know what balcony we're going to jump out, all of us, because if that happens, then yeah, I don't even want to think about it. But we are in, I think, in more dangerous times than we have been for a long time, when it was isolated countries that had governments that were problematic for the EU and populist, authoritarian, even not liberal anymore, falling out of the category of liberal democracy. We're sitting in one of them. I think that was I wouldn't say it was handleable. It was possible to cope with this for the EU. But I think that having this undercurrent in all of Europe, also Western European countries, of the same kind of populism sneaking into all areas of public life, is really a very, very serious warning to all of us who are somehow in our work and in our academic work trying to defend those values that makes it possible for us even to sit in this room and have a discussion.
Precisely, and these are the values that also make it possible for some of these actors to eventually rise and come to power. Thank you very much, Marlene. Moving on from this not so optimistic scene setting, which is anyhow fairly typical of the panels that I sit on, I want to now move to Laurenz. We have elections coming up in Austria next week. Austria is one of our focus countries of our AuthLIB project, within which we explore illiberal actors more closely in 7 countries. But still, I feel Austria is usually somewhat less talked about. Could you please give us a little bit of an overview about the main illiberal, in this case, ideologically far-right actor, the Freedom Party of Austria? What is the appeal behind the party in the current context, and what are your expectations for next week's elections?
Sure, thank you. Thanks for having me. All the water that came down prevented me from going to Budapest, but I'm happy to join you online here. So we're about to have elections to the Austrian Parliament next, or like the Sunday after the next, and the FPÖ is on track to be the strongest party for the first time since 1945. The FPÖ is actually a quite old party, was founded in the 1950s and had like mostly, like for decades was a really like marginal party, but then was basically making a move towards a more populist style of politics and also mobilizing on some like more modern or newer issues like immigration from the 90s onwards, and became extremely successful in that course and has been a member of the Austrian government 4 times so far. And it's possible, not the most likely outcome in my view, but possible that it will also be a part of the next government. So the most relevant issues for FPÖ to mobilize are of course anti-immigrant sentiment. There's also COVID that still lingers in the background. COVID was a very, very polarizing issue in Austria. Austria was one of the only countries in the world that like actually at least passed by law a vaccine mandate, even though it was never implemented and later scrapped. But COVID was really a gift for the FPÖ in terms of mobilizing people that it maybe hadn't previously reached. And it, of course, also was the only party to strongly take take a very unsupportive position towards Ukraine in the Russian invasion. And another issue that is a bit under the radar, but has become extremely important for mobilizing, or at least differentiates FPÖ voters strongly from from actually all other voters, is severe skepticism or rejection of climate protection measures. So immigration, COVID, Ukraine, climate, those are four of the central issues, plus, of course, a generic European Union skepticism. What we can also say about the party at the moment is that while in previous elections, or in the run-up to previous elections, it had tried to moderate and adapt somewhat to like the mainstream, that is now absent. So previously, the party had tried to appeal more to potential coalition partners and also appear more like ready for government and for like put on a more statesman-like rhetoric and appearance. And that is not at all happening at the moment. So there's no visible signs of moderation on the part of the party, which may have to do with the fact that it's on track to be the strongest party and may therefore like claim to lead the government and not only enter it as a junior coalition partner as it has done in the past. So for the post-election government formation process, it's going to be very interesting. The pivotal party in this is not going to be the FPÖ, because there's only one party that would ever enter a government together with the FPÖ. That's the Christian Democratic ÖVP. And it's mostly on them to decide what shape the next government will look like, even though they are on track to lose a large share of their voters after 5 years in government. And they are now, but they will still be the pivotal party, and it probably will depend on their calculations and whether they can see a way forward with the FPÖ or would prefer a coalition with other parties where they could maybe still be the leading party in government, which is always attractive. So it's a little uncertain what the outcome of this, or it's actually quite uncertain what the outcome of this election in terms of government formation will be, but it's clear that there's going to be a massive strengthening of the FPÖ.
Thank you very much, Laurenz. And it's very interesting what you're saying about the lack of moderation in this electoral campaign, which I think is also very much in line with the pan-European trend that characterizes the far right. But we can look even further to the United States, which Marlene mentioned before. We definitely see a complete lack of moderation there. Laurenz, you mentioned that some of the issues that FPÖ mobilizes on are immigration, climate skepticism, which might be something actually new, and maybe we come back to this later, but also COVID. And essentially, these are topics which challenge the incumbent government and their governance. So on this note, I wanted to turn to Petra and ask you to put the Czech illiberals into a little bit of context for us. Because yes, I said that some of these topics are challenging the incumbent, but still in the case of FPÖ, we see a clear far-right ideology. That's not so in the case of ANO and Babiš. So what is it that the Czech illiberals can really tap into, and what characterizes them?
Thank you, and hello everybody. I'm sorry I'm not in a beautiful Budapest, but we have a lot of water on roadways throughout the country, and I'm happy that I can be here. So what ANO exemplifies is the hybrid nature of populist movements that blur traditional left-right divides. In fact, Andrej Babiš calls himself a catch-all party. I have no idea which of his advisors recommended this to him, but basically he presents himself as party for everybody. The party instead focuses on personal leadership, tapping into voter frustration with traditional political structures. The ANO strategy appeal, I would say, rests on 4 pillars, and these will be very, I think, detectable across Europe for similar parties, but also one I think is different. What is similar is the performative, strong leadership. So this is a party which has very few members, which is the leader has a super strong hold. There basically almost no internal democratic mechanism. Then the second, which I think is very common, is the anti-establishment rhetoric. So despite Babish's own involvement in politics and business, he effectively portrays himself as an outsider, as a disruptor, as somebody fighting the corrupt elites, and he's echoing in this way the core populist sentiments. What's different is, I would say, economic pragmatism, or I call it chameleonic nature. So basically, as the party does not have any clear ideology, it just follows. Follows public sentiment. So basically, if you ask where does ANO stand on a policy X, you just need to look into public opinion and see where the majority is, and that will be the ANO position. I think what ANO has managed to do over time is to solidify a base which mostly relies on senior citizens. And I think this is something we should be watching for across Europe as traditional parties decline. They were able to kind of create a coalition programmatically for all generations. And this generational divide is something that really keeps me up awake, because Europe is aging. We have demographic decline. And I think this is going to be further, let's say, threats on which these illiberal leaders can pull to see how strong representative democracy will hold together. So I would say certain economic pragmatism is something I would add there. And finally, what I think is also no longer unique to Babiš is this technocracy. So depolitization of politics. He is not inviting people to be active participants, to be active citizens. On the contrary, this is audience democracy, what Nadia Urbinati would call it in her amazing book, Democratic Disfigurations. This is telling people, I will take care of it for you. You just give me the votes, and I'll be there. I'll be there for you. I just want to, in reaction to Laurenz, maybe say a small point why ANO can not really go into the anti-vax, because ANO governed during the pandemic. So they are actually trying to make this a non-topic as much as possible. And its biggest challenge, it's ANO's biggest challenge in the next year's parliamentary elections, is actually finding a coalition partner to govern with. And these probably will be, for now, fragmented populist radical right, but we are seeing a certain consolidation, also thanks to their success in the European parliamentary elections. We have actual elections in 3 days in Czech Republic. There was some debate whether we should hold them or not, but I think the Czech state has the capacity to hold elections even with floods. And that's going to be about whether ANO will succeed more in the regional governments, where there was so far a strong cordon sanitaire against its hold on power. We are also seeing a bit of a shift in strategy. And final word, what I would like to say is that these chameleonic policies, I mean, they are not without direction. And we are seeing increasingly, especially on the issue of Ukraine and migration, flirting of ANO with nationalism and nativism. And that can be actually pondering too. So we are actually seeing radicalization of ANO in view of potentially coalescing with successful populist radical right parties.
Thank you, Petra. And this last point is extremely interesting and might also explain why ANO actually joined the Patriots for Europe in the European Parliament. And maybe this is something that we can also return to a little bit later, what is in store for the party later on, whether it needs to adopt a sort of ideology that informs its positions and therefore might reduce its chameleonic nature, or whether that's not necessary. But on the policy point, Petra pretty much said that the policy of ANO goes where the people are. This might be less so in the case of FPÖ, which does have an ideological core. It's a nativist far-right party. And Laurenz, you have previously studied the impact of FPÖ on various policy domains. Should the party manage to enter government or maybe even lead government after these elections, what are your expectations? How would FPÖ impact policies in Austria, and whether the party would go further? Would it impact the polity? Would it impact the quality of democracy, not just in terms of values of pluralism, protection of minorities, which I'm assuming it would, as it did before, but would it actually affect the institutions behind democracy as well? Could it do so?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So the areas that I would watch most closely if the FPÖ ended up in government would be asylum policy, of course. That's a given, basically. If we look at what's happening in Germany, also in the Netherlands, with the announcements recently, so I would strongly assume that the FPÖ would chart a course that would also follow these examples. I think we should also probably assume that we will see social policies that where the FPÖ has in the past, together with the ÖVP, tried to implement welfare chauvinistic measures, that to be taken up again. All these attempts failed in the past because of constitutional or European law constraints, and we can talk about those, but I would assume that they will try again. Some other measures that could be, or some other policy areas that could be affected is, of course, all the measures that have in the past few years been taken against climate change. So we now had a relatively active government, although it was quite controversial, but a lot of activity on climate policies, given that the Green Party was the junior coalition partner. And I would also assume that in terms of internal security policies, like police rights and those things, that the FPÖ would try to be very active. I think the FPÖ would also, so one of its core policy proposal, more of institutional change or constitutional change proposals, is to introduce a basically Swiss-style system of a popular initiative that we already have popular initiatives, but they would try and make referendums mandatory from a certain threshold. That was actually already in the coalition agreement when the FPÖ was in government last time, but then there was this video from a Spanish island that everybody has seen that kind of thwarted the whole process. But I would strongly suspect that this will be on the agenda again. So a much more direct democratic, circumventing parliament, giving basically legislative powers to voters directly. This is something that could only be implemented in Austria after a referendum, after 2/3 of MPs in parliament have agreed to it, and a referendum has also been passed. So the hurdles are quite high for this. And I think it's unlikely to actually happen, but it will be certainly something that they will try. I also think we should look out for some of the core areas of the state, like the police, the intelligence agencies that have been under strong pressure and have been really by party actors, but also by Russia, like uh, become undermined to some extent, to the extent that they need to be completely overhauled. And I would strongly assume that the FPÖ will try to curtail the public broadcaster in Austria. So specific media outlets would be under attack or under severe pressure, I think. That may also be true of schools and universities to some degree. For instance, in the election manifesto, the FPÖ proposes that there should be like a reporting office for teachers at school who kind of do undue politicizing in classes. And they also want to fight like gender mania and the allegedly repressive climate at universities. This is somewhat unspecific, but yeah, it's unclear whether there's like any specific policies behind that or whether it's mostly rhetoric at the moment. So I think we have some institutional, we like the FPÖ as it is constituted now definitely envisages a completely different way of running a democracy. So a much more direct democracy based, a much more popular democracy with fewer institutional safeguards, also less power for courts. They have like a chapter in their manifesto that says explicitly we have to curb the power of the European Court of Justice and the European Court of Human Rights, so that Austria becomes more sovereign again. And I think even though this becomes difficult to envisage how they will actually do this, I think they will try and go into open confrontation with the European Court of Justice, the European Court of Human Rights. And so I think we could just see a lot of pressure on the judicial constraints that actually safeguard some of the individual rights and minority rights in Austria. So I would strongly assume that they would try and push against these constraints.
Thank you very much, Laurenz. It seems that we do have a full menu both in terms of policy and potential institutional changes. One thing that caught my attention, one of the many things that caught my attention in your contribution is this mention of lobbying for referendums and tools of direct democracy. Now, we hear that in the Czech Republic from a similarly far-right actor, SPD, of Tomio Okamura, but not so much from AMO, and would not really fall in line with what you have been mentioning, Petra, about the technocratization of politics, of governance in the case of Babiš. Although elections on the national level are still a bit further off, how do you see AMO's challenge to democracy as such in the Czech Republic? How would it compare to that broad menu that Laurenz just have described in the case of Austria?
Yeah, thank you. So I will try to be brief. I would say the challenges are for personalization of power. So I think even if and I will get to SPD after I name this four. So personalization of power, conflict of interest. Andrej Babiš is the largest recipient of EU funds or his companies are, which he claims are not his, whatever. Agrofert is one of the largest recipients of EU subsidies and also national funds. I think also this performative nature of technocratic governance, dissent, and let's say distaste for democratic checks and balances, which are regarded as obstacles to effective governance and are presenting as such, including this year, that was a new thing, attack on the constitutional court. I think also erosion of democratic norms. Going back to before I compare them, like what is the difference between populist radical right and maybe ANO. I mean, the comparison would be ANO's ideological flexibility versus populist radical right, exclusionary nationalism, institutional subversion in the hands of ANO, more than overt authoritarianism, which Laurenz has painted a terrifying picture of, corruption and ideology and oligarchy against ideological extremism of the populist radical right. I also think that actually when you Zsuzsa mentioned patriots, the patriots, I think it's two things are interesting: who joined and who was preventing from joining. And this is part of a two-level game par excellence. It's a domestic play. So for a long time, SPD of Tomio Okamura populist radical right has fancied itself as a potential partner, but he is not the desired partner. There are others. There are more new elements on the populist radical right, which are for now fragmented, but there are actually efforts as we speak by the former president Miloš Zeman to unify, and Václav Klaus. So two former presidents are joining power to kind of bring these elements together as a potential junior partner for Babiš. And what they are hoping for, and I think they have been succeeding so far, if I look at the preferences, is to basically cannibalize SPD with offering similar policy agenda, but by different subjects, and those would be the coalition partners for Babiš. So I think here we are seeing also what actually can prevent it. Coalition politics. I mean, this is not just about governance. When we speak about governance in our countries, it's coalition governments, and in coalitions you need consensus. And I think any coalition partner Andrej Babiš ever had paid a very dear price of being cannibalized. And actually Tomio Okamura never even became it, and he skipped the part of being a partner to just being cannibalized, which is ongoing. So I thought that is interesting. And finally, I would just like to say, I mean, this is something we are seeing, and where I see a big difference between populist radical right and this technocratic offer of ANO. It's a different form of politics, while the, let's say, populist radical right is trying to subvert the protection of minorities. This is what all the policies Laurenz has mentioned have in common, is actually that they're minority protections. And so this is at the heart of representative liberal democracy, is that the majority rules, but minority is protected. And by direct democracy, it's just dismantling another form. So every of this policy is just weakening minority protection in the name of majority rule. This is not what Andrej Babiš is offering. He's offering he will govern for everybody. He's even asking offering parties to, like, just bring me your points. I will implement them. Bring me your policies, but I will be the one who will implement them. And I think this is a very dangerous form of politics that just creates state as a firm.
Thank you very much, Petra. As I'm listening to you, I cannot help but think that some of the let's call it instruments of capturing power really resonate with what we have been observing also in Hungary, except in the case of Hungary, in the case of Fidesz, we do have also the additional layer of ideology. But the tactics, the instruments are very, very similar. And I would follow up along these lines with a question towards Marlene, and knowing that you are also studying the role of institutions, particularly courts, in safeguarding democracy at the intersection of law and politics. How do you see this new wave of illiberals tackling that safeguard that would still be in place in the form of courts, in the form of institutions. Is their challenge, again, what I previously was also hinting at, somehow fundamentally different? And what fuels their success actually in this regard? Because they do seem to be successful with their fundamentally majoritarian ideas.
Well, thank you very much, Zsuzsanna. I think if I just comment on some of the stuff that has been said. I think that sometimes those of us who are academics and look at these movements, we have a tendency perhaps to botanize. I don't know if that's the right word in English, but you get too many details, and then you start focusing on all the differences instead of elevating yourself up in the helicopter and looking down at what's actually going on. Because I actually think there are many more commonalities than there are differences. If you look at the literature on populism, there was a time when everyone said it's the economy stupid. It's disadvantaged people. If people feel disadvantaged or don't like globalization, they will turn to populism. And of course, what we can see here is it's prosperous countries we are talking about. So that narrative doesn't work anymore. So now it's culture stupid. It's not economic stupid, it's culture stupid. And what do I mean when I say that? I wrote about it in my book, The Tribalization of Europe, that came out a few years ago, where I explain how Orban had used culture in many different ways. It doesn't have to be, it's a mix of oligarchism with immigrants, with Voghism. It's a design policy. There was a book coming out a few years ago called The Spin Dictators, and I think that what they have in common, all these different varieties, as you talk about in your project, different kind of versions of populism, is that they are designed from above. So whether you have the Austrian version, the Czech version, the Slovak version, the Hungarian version, even the Danish version, the version from Italy, it's all designed from the top with well-educated people who are constantly commenting, now you should suggest this because now the people's sentiment goes in this direction, now you should suggest that, and then constantly monitoring the public debate and also designing the public debate and the narratives. It's different in different countries, but I think it's very dangerous if we as academics start to instead of seeing this, then start to focus too much on the differences, because what they are really doing is the same. It's cynical, top-down, building up of it's a little bit what Putin is also doing to Western Europe, that he is designing these stories, he is polarizing, he is suggesting, offering easy solutions to things. So it's different in different countries, but I still think that it's this top-down, using misinformation, disinformation, cornering certain types of actors, people, minorities, and so on. So I just want to warn that we have to really also focus on the commonalities and the strategies that are used by these different oligarchic populists who have one thing in common: they want power. And they want to sit on the economy. And the way to do that is sometimes to come up with a narrative about Voghism or immigrants or more referenda or whatever, because referenda, of course, is obviously very, very nice, right? So you can pretend that you want to listen to the people. Nobody will check whether you actually do what the people want afterwards, but you can at least have this narrative that you listen to the people. Now, just to come back to your question about the courts, because that's something I have a certain affinity to, because I think that if you look at the constitutionalist literature, academic literature, you actually also among constitutional lawyers have a certain search of populism. What do I mean by that? It's a very, very big chart to come up with here. If you look at a book like that came out in 2022 by Martin Laughlin called Against Constitutionalism, what is that book really about? It's saying, and people like Joe Weiler at the NYU, he supports this argument. It's a lot of lawyers who you used to see as supportive of constitutional democracy, of balance of powers, of courts to protect minorities, and so on. All of a sudden, all of these academics say that, all right, it's been too much with all these courts since the Second World War, with all the courts wanting to decide about national policies. We should give power back to the people. We should give power back to the majority in parliament. Can you imagine? This is really crazy, if you ask me. So we have, on the one hand, a group of scholars since the Second World War who said we need strong courts to balance the parliament. That's what we've learned in school, right? That this is the way it should be. And now within the past, I would say 5-10 years, we have more and more scholars, in particular legal scholars, who are all of a sudden turning around and saying, oh no, now we see in Poland and Hungary that people have had enough. People have had enough of courts who overrule what the parliament really wants. It's crazy, right? It's amazing that we are seeing, even among solid academics from London School of Economics, from NYU, from many other corners. I have written a paper about it. I hope it comes out soon. I call it populist constitutionalism. And that is on top of everything empirical that is going on in all kinds of directions, and we see the populism everywhere. It's an undercurrent. It's pushing to the establishment as well, because the establishment, look at Germany, now they are imposing border control. They are probably going to do a lot of other initiatives. But on top of all the empirical, we also had this kind of normative argument that it was simply too much to have all these courts decide over the parliament, and now we should go back to the old philosophy of majoritarian democracy, of having the people decide, because in the end the people are the majority is the true representation of the people, and therefore the courts are elitist, they are non-elected, they should not be sitting either at the national level. That's the argument. Neither at the national level should we have too strong constitutional courts and too strong judges, and nor on the EU level and at the, of course, Strasbourg level. So it's not just an empirical, that's my point, it's not just an empirical phenomenon. We are also in the academic Western debate seeing this kind of surge of anti-constitutionalisms, constitutional democracy, and sort of a trend going back to majoritarian democracy, where it's the majority who decides. It can either be more referenda, but it can also be the kind of the majority elected for parliament. It doesn't even have to be a majority government. It can just be the majority in parliament should never be overruled by a court outside the parliament saying this is wrong, because if there's a majority behind it, then who is a court, non-elected judges, to say that that is not fine? I mean, actually, you may not believe it, but Scandinavia, where I come from, has always been anti-constitutionalist. We have never had judicial review. We have never had courts stepping down on what the parliament wants. So a lot of politicians in the Scandinavian countries, they are looking out in Europe and saying, wow, they are somehow copying us. But they are not really aware that this is actually a potentially quite populist way of running democracy. In particular, if you look at Second World War and what happened after the Second World War, where the decision was, because of the Holocaust, we need to have a checks and balances. We need to have powerful institutions to keep the majority in check. That never happened in Scandinavia, in the UK neither. So in our part of the world, it was always, no, we don't want courts to interfere in what the people wants. And it was a very natural thing that 20 years ago, the Danish People Party in Denmark, which assimilates a lot of what you're talking about in your different countries, they had a huge win. And what happened? Nobody questioned, oh, wow, okay, yeah. So they got very popular. Then it's natural that they didn't come into power, but they became part of the right-wing coalition where they propped up the government. And and there was nobody questioned it because it's been part of the political culture that the majority is always right. And I see tendencies in the constitutional literature these years that there is a going back to this, I would say, pre-war approach to politics, that if that's what people want, then we should not start picking certain elements and saying you're not allowed to have this opinion. You should be allowed to do what you want, because in a democracy, it's not about the rule of law. It's mainly about deciding for yourself what you want. And if that's what a majority wants, then, the judges should stay back and not interfere. So I see some broader tendencies in the world, and it's quite. I think it's quite frightening that we are having this debate right now. That it's not only something happening on the ground in different versions in different countries, but it's also sort of starting to emerge as an academic discussion. Mm-hmm. And no one is really challenging this. It's just happening, and it's even among the most respected legal scholars out there.
Thank you very much, Marlene. And it's extremely interesting because we started out with discussing some of our usual suspects: political parties, illiberal political parties challenging liberal democracy, and we are ending on a note of intellectuals actually fueling that very type of challenge, which illiberal parties then very much tap back into. We do see that trend as well. We are not ending on a positive note, and given the severity of the challenge, I don't mind that. We have 1 minute of our scheduled time left. I would like to take 1 or 2 questions from the audience, not to let you leave without audience participation. And then we will unfortunately need to wrap up our conversation, if there are questions in the audience. Do we have an additional? Thank you. And please introduce yourself, and also I would like to point out the difference between a question and a comment. Thank you. Given the time pressure.
So, can you hear me? Okay. So I am Ben Sabari of CUDI, and I would like to ask a question regarding something that I found really interesting as a comment during the presentations. That is of the generational divide as a factor when it comes to populist mobilization, because I think, to my knowledge, in certain contexts, this does come up, whether there is like a correlation between usually senior citizenship and related viewpoints and support for authoritarianism. But these are usually, like, let us say, like the context of Czechia and Hungary, but I don't know anything of the Western context, like in this regard, whether it's also a factor there, whether it's like, it has its certain specificities, why, older or actually younger people vote for these parties. So I would like to, invite the speakers to answer to this question.
Thank you very much. And if there's anybody else, then I would take 1 more question. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much. My name is Bálint Mikola. I'm also from the CEU Democracy Institute and a part of the AuthLIB project, and I especially enjoyed this panel. And I would like to ask that, so here we are discussing illiberalism in Europe, and one interesting mismatch I often find when we try to identify these parties is that few of them actually use the illiberal label themselves. And is that a mismatch between political reality and academic discussions, or is it a mislabeling exercise, or what's going on? Are these parties really illiberal, or is it how we see them? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Turning to our panel, who would like to pick up one or the other question? I would maybe start with our online panelists first, if you would like to jump in. Petra.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the questions. I will say on the generational divide, I think it has to do, I mean, in terms of value orientations, I want to make an important caveat, and that is that in many of these surveys and in many of these analyses, the young people, we stop too early, in my opinion, because being critical of representative democracy does not, for me, mean that you want authoritarianism. So I think that, the way to save democracy is actually more democracy, no less. I would not necessarily go the road of direct democracy for the reasons I mentioned in the previous intervention. So I think that we are we are being too strict with the young people. But of course, I think there are worrying trends to watch for. And I think some of the democratic reforms that are more inclusive, such as lowering voting age, this is some of my favorite things to do. We have seen it in Austria. We are seeing it in other countries. And in terms of illiberalism in response to Bálint, I mean, I think Bálint, there will be books written on that. And the answer, as typical for a political scientist, is it depends. There are some that love to embrace this, and that's most of all Orbán Viktor, who has this program. But and some of it is simply our analysis. And if I may, just one small point, I want to echo what Marlene has said, and I think we are living in the times of Carl Schmitt. And I think I would invite the audience to go and reread Carl Schmitt, because a lot of these elements we are seeing, you will see there clearly, and you will know what to look for when you are analyzing politics, because this is an agenda which Carl Schmitt has been pushing in the 30s, and we have seen where it ended and why the courts were necessary safeguard to protect actually all of us, because all of us in a certain aspect of our personality are a minority. And so, yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Petra. Laurenz, please.
Yeah, quite briefly. So the age gradient in voting behavior in Austria doesn't affect the FPÖ so much. Older voters vote more for the two major parties, or the erstwhile major parties, the Social Democrats and the Christian Democrats, more so than younger parties, younger voters. But the FPÖ doesn't have a really strong age gradient in its support profile. With respect to liberalism, the FPÖ, the F in FPÖ stands for freedom, and it's called the Freedom Party of Austria. And it used to be part of the Liberal International until the 1980s. The parties, of course, it's a conflicted story. So the party manifesto that I've quoted a few times now has the weird title of Fortress of Liberty, which is kind of a contradiction in itself, but that's sort of their I think that sums it up quite nicely. So I think the party has sort of a liberal tradition, which is now buried and gone mostly, but it would never endorse the illiberal label. it wouldn't also like use the term liberal to describe itself, but it would paint itself as like defenders of freedom and liberty, which of course, well, whatever that means, those liberties and freedoms are of course like limited to a specific set of people and to a specific group in the population.
And it indeed does formulate its policies in that way, targeting those freedoms to a very specific group of people. Marlene.
Thank you. I was fearing you wouldn't give me the word.
Of course I would.
In the final word, because I really want to answer this. Actually, I think that the question about the labeling of illiberalism, a very famous, I'm sure you know her, Ennser-Jedenastik, she's very well known here in Hungary. She has done a lot of studies showing that the modern type autocrat, they pretend on the surface to have all the institutions of a liberal democracy. They would never take a court away. They would never take a parliament away. They would never say they didn't have media or civil society. What they do is something different. They pack them with their friends. But on the surface, if you came from another planet, landed in Hungary, you would say, click the box. They have a parliament. Great. Click the box. They have a court. Great, no problem. Click the box. There are people in the street. They don't look afraid. So we have a civil society. And click the box to the media without looking into the substance of what's actually going on. So I think it's very, very important. These labels are not very interesting. What is interesting is what's going on, and how the practices are carried out. And the Franken state was one of the articles she wrote, Ennser-Jedenastik, showing that you can be perfectly, you can look perfectly liberal, but the way, and we've seen the same in Poland during the peace government, but under the surface, it's not. Of course, a real liberal, it's rather illiberal. And that's also, in my opinion, one of the reasons why the EU has been so long about addressing both Poland and Hungary. Fortunately, Poland is on the right track, or we hope so, right now. We still don't know, but it's on the way. But I think one of the reasons why the European Commission has had such a hard time over the past 10 years, 15 years almost now, addressing Orban, is that, on the surface, it all looks right. And according to the treaties, you need to live up to the Copenhagen criteria, you sign up to the Article 2 and so on, but there's no check on the actual material praxis of being a democracy. And that is one of the big problems in Europe, in my opinion, that we have not developed a qualitative. I could talk about this for hours, because I have also looked into how the European Court of Justice, by taking more and more cases about judicial independence and so on, that the court is gradually forced to define what is not just a liberal democracy or constitutional democracy, but also how to what degree is a court independent when the judges are appointed in this and that way. These kind of cases are coming now to the court, and it's going to be very interesting, because that will tell us something about how the court may be able to develop some instruments to actually not only challenge the usual suspects in the room, but my country as well, because in my country, formally, as in Germany as well, it's either the politicians or the majority in parliament or the Minister of Justice who appoint the judges. So I think that is very important. The labels are not that important, but discussion is really interesting. And then just very briefly about the generational thing, at least in Germany with the AfD, it was a big success among the young. The young just loved them, and in particular the young men. And I think we are back to something Donald Trump like, you know, with, oh, he's a strong man, he's great, he's efficient, he's a strong man. I think they just like that. I mean, and they just like their disruption, and then just like someone who is pulling some jokes off. So I think it's very difficult to generalize about whether young people are more likely to be authoritarian or not. At least it counters all the literature, all what we have learned, that it's the older generation who likes this most and so on. And the AfD, it was the young people who gave them 30% of the vote. And I think that's a very interesting point, and I cannot answer why, but
it seems we are not even safe from
No.
the young people anymore. Yes, lots of interesting points, and I would really love to hear more from all three of you, but unfortunately we need to wrap things up. I'm really grateful for all three of you who have joined the panel, and also our audience here at Nádor utca in Budapest, at Budapest Forum. I'm very glad that we have been able to show some of the varieties of illiberalism, but also some of the commonalities of illiberalism and the practice that we need to pay attention to, because we see more and more that despite the variation, the practice travels, and that might be something that, hopefully not, but that we might be seeing also in the United States. It's certainly in already the pages of Project 2025, just to give an outlook beyond Europe. So thank you once again, all of you, for being here. Those of you who are here on the spot, I encourage you to pick up some of our flyers and visit our website. Those of you who will be watching us online, I also invite you to visit us at AuthLIB.eu, that is AuthLIB.eu, where you can find out more about our work on illiberalism and how to potentially, hopefully, counter that in Europe. Thank you very much for being here with us today.